Chapter 1. The Green Shade. Over the Ledger. Mrs. Eleanor Shaw's first impression of the Lantern House Inn was not of the inn itself, but of a lamp. It stood in the front parlour on a round walnut table, rather too elegant for the room around it, with a dark green glass shade that cast its light in a close, concentrated pool upon a ledger left open beside it. The rest of the room faded gently away into brown polish, old horsehair chairs, and a wallpaper of climbing roses gone the colour of weak tea. Yet that lamp made a little stage of its own, as though someone had been called away from important work and intended very firmly to return. Eleanor noticed such things. She had been a schoolmistress for 30 years and had spent half of them learning that a child's abandoned exercise book, a misplaced ruler, or an ink blot in the wrong place could tell more truth than a direct explanation ever did. She paused just inside the doorway, her gloves still on, while behind her the wind pressed a scatter of wet leaves against the panes with the soft insistence of fingers. "Do come in properly," said a pleasant voice. "If one hovers near the threshold in this house, the draught settles on one's bones and takes possession." The speaker was a small elderly lady with a folded shawl of dove-grey wool about her shoulders and an expression at once mild and attentively alive. She sat near the fire with a basket of mending beside her, though Eleanor saw at once that very little mending had been accomplished. The threaded needle rested ready, and the stocking in her lap had not advanced by more than a few careful stitches. Mrs. Shaw smiled. "You're very likely correct. The weather has followed me all the way from Bath, and I think it bears a grudge." "That sort often does," said Miss Marple. "I knew a woman in St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Creswell, who said wind was like an offended family. It came round corners where no one invited it, and stayed longer than decency permitted. She was a tiresome woman in many respects, but she had a gift for putting things exactly." Eleanor came farther in and held out her hand. "Mrs. Shaw, we are to meet, I think, at supper, though I am glad not to wait so long for at least one friendly face." Miss Marple took her hand with warmth. "Jane Marple, one generally does much better to begin with the friendliest face available. Later on, people become complicated." That was said in a tone so harmless that Eleanor laughed before realising it was not, perhaps entirely a joke. There were 6 guests expected for the weekend, she had been told, though weekend suggested a cheerfulness not quite borne out by the inn's faded grandeur. The Lantern House had once served coaches on the Old Marsh Road and now housed antiquarian society dinners, modest shooting parties in season, and occasional solitary people who preferred places where the carpets muffled one's steps and no one asked too many questions. Eleanor had come at the invitation of her cousin, Dr. Felix Anstruther, who was delayed until evening. He had written that the inn would suit her particularly because it possessed quiet books and an excellent cold ham. It was the kind of recommendation only a bachelor cousin could imagine complete. From somewhere deeper in the house came the muted sound of a door closing, and then a man's voice, genial and resonant, speaking over another person with the confidence of a long habit. Miss Marple's eyes moved very slightly toward the ceiling. "Our host?" Eleanor asked. "In a manner," said Miss Marple, "Mr. Ambrose Vale has taken it upon himself to behave as if he owns not only the occasion, but the moral right to arrange everybody within it. He does not own the inn, of course. That belongs to Mrs. Trevelyan, who is upstairs with one of her headaches. But possession, as they say, often begins in the voice." There was no malice in the remark. That made it sharper. Mr. Vale entered the room a moment later, and Eleanor saw at once how thoroughly he had practised charm. He was a handsome man in late age, broad in the shoulders, silver-haired, smoothly shaved, and dressed with a negligence that had clearly required planning. His smile was quick, paternal, and just restrained enough to imply he did not offer it to everyone. "Ah, our latest arrival," he said. "How good! Lantern House improves by increments, and the best increments arrive after 4 o'clock. Earlier guests are always fretful from travel." He took Eleanor's hand only lightly, then turned with equal fluency to Miss Marple. "And Miss Marple has already made you feel at home, I have no doubt. She has the most reassuring presence. One feels that if one had mislaid a pearl brooch or a nephew, she would produce it from a work-basket." Miss Marple smiled as though she had been complimented on jam-making. "Only if the nephew were very small and had the good sense not to wriggle." Mr. Vale laughed. He laughed very well. It had a practised rise and fall and ended before it could become vulgar. Eleanor, who had known 2 headmistresses and 1 bishop's wife with the same accomplishment, distrusted it instantly. Another woman appeared in the doorway carrying a sheaf of folded account papers and a ring of keys. She was perhaps in her middle 40s, plainly dressed in dark blue, with smooth brown hair parted exactly at the centre and drawn into a knot so neat it looked severe from a distance. Yet when she lifted her face there was nothing severe in it. Rather, there was an odd gentleness, a diffidence even, that made one want to put her at ease. "Mr. Vale?" she said. "Mrs. Trevelyan asked whether the invoices for the wine merchant had been settled before Thursday, because he has written twice about the porter." Then she saw Eleanor and checked herself. "I beg your pardon. I did not know. "My dear Miss Harwood," said Vale, taking the papers from her with a familiarity that appeared innocent and was not, "you preserve us all from collapse. Mrs. Shaw, this is Miss Celia Harwood, who keeps the inn from drifting bodily into the marshes." Miss Harwood gave a slight smile that transformed her face. "That is much too large a task. I only keep the sums from wandering." She would have gone at once, Eleanor thought, had Miss Marple not spoken. "How very useful," Miss Marple said. "My nephew Raymond always says figures are the only honest things in England, but I have never found it so. They can be made to tell dreadful fibs if one arranges them cleverly. In St. Mary Mead there was a grocer named Mr. Pollitt, who kept 2 account books, one for his business and one for his conscience. It ended, as such things usually do, in tears and a very public sale of sardines." Celia Harwood looked at her fully then, not long, only a second. But in that second Eleanor saw something keen and startled pass through the woman's eyes before the softness came back over them. "I dare say that is true," Miss Harwood said, "though I hope my own books are more straightforward than Mr. Pollitt's. Mrs. Trevelyan depends on them." She turned away. As she did so, one of the folded papers slipped from the bundle Vale had taken. It drifted to the carpet by the green-shaded lamp. Eleanor bent automatically to retrieve it, but Miss Harwood had already stooped with unexpected swiftness. Her fingers closed over the page and folded it inward so quickly that Eleanor saw only a narrow column of names, and beside one of them, a word struck through twice in dark pencil. Not paid, a small thing, perhaps nothing. Yet Miss Harwood's hand trembled after she rose, and she tucked the paper beneath the others with a care that was almost tenderness. Vale either did not notice or chose not to. "Supper at 7:30, he said. "We are still waiting for Dr. Anstruther and a Mr. Julian Peveril, who's motoring down from London with a manuscript under his arm and vanity under both. Until then, the drawing-room is at your disposal, and the sherry on the sideboard is less disappointing than one has a right to expect." When he had gone, carrying the papers with him, and drawing Miss Harwood in his wake merely by continuing to speak, Eleanor exhaled without realizing she had been holding her breath. "What an extraordinary man," she said. Miss Marple threaded her needle at last. "Oh, I think it's not extraordinary. Very recognizable, really. There was a churchwarden in St. Mary Mead called Edgar Flint, who was always helping women carry parcels they had not asked him to carry. Everyone said how kind he was. It was kindness of a sort, you know, but he liked the feeling of deciding where things belonged." Eleanor sat down opposite her. The fire gave off a faint smell of soot and orange peel, as if the grate had been cleaned in haste and perfumed in apology. "You do not like him, my dear. Liking has very little to do with understanding. I dare say many people are fond of Mr. Vale. That is generally the way when someone has made a habit of arranging scenes to flatter the audience. What interests me is not his charm. It is the fact that Miss Harwood is frightened of one page in a ledger." Eleanor looked at the green pool of lamplight. The open book still lay there, abandoned yet waiting. "You noticed that at once." Miss Marple's hands moved in and out of the grey wool. "One notices what does not match. She's a careful woman, not a fluttering one. Careful women do not snatch up ordinary papers as if they had touched a hot coal." Outside in the stable yard, wheels ground against wet gravel. Another guest had arrived. Voices moved under the window, muffled and indistinct. Then, from somewhere overhead, there came the brief metallic sound of a bell being rung sharply once, and then not again. Miss Marple paused with the stocking in her hand. "That," she said mildly, "is almost always the sort of thing one remembers too late." Chapter 2. What the Staircase Remembered. Mrs. Eleanor Shaw did not at first connect the sound of the bell with anything at all. It was, after all, an old house. Old houses produce small, isolated noises in the way that elderly people made remarks half to themselves. A creak here, a faint tap there, something dropped or shifted in a room one had not yet explored. She might have dismissed it entirely if Miss Marple had not spoken of it as something that would be remembered too late. That remark, gentle as it had been, lingered. The arrival in the yard announced itself more fully now. A motor-car door shut with a firmness that suggested impatience rather than fatigue, and a man's voice followed quickly, clipped, and carrying that particular note of self-importance which assumes it will be forgiven as wit. Eleanor rose, drawn by curiosity as much as courtesy, and moved toward the window. The stable yard lay under a wavering lantern, its light broken by the slow drip from the eaves. A tall man in a dark travelling coat stood beside the car, speaking to the inn's porter, a stooped fellow whose cap sat too far back on his head, as if it had once belonged to a larger man. The newcomer gestured with a long, narrow leather case tucked under his arm. "A manuscript, I should think," Eleanor murmured. "Almost certainly," said Miss Marple, without looking up from her work. Men who carry their own manuscripts tend to do so as if they were escorting something of great delicacy and equal importance. It is rarely the manuscript that requires such protection. Eleanor smiled faintly. "You have known such men before." "My nephew Raymond writes books," Miss Marple said. "He does not carry them about under his arm, but I have met others who do. There was a young man in St. Mary Mead, Mr. Leonard Briggs, who insisted on reading aloud from his own poetry, to anyone who could not escape in time. He believed his words were improving the village. They were not, of course, but one could not say so without appearing unkind. The man in the yard now lifted his case with a little flourish, as though aware of being observed, and turned toward the entrance. Eleanor stepped back from the window. "I suppose we shall meet him at supper." "Oh yes," said Miss Marple, "and he will say something that sounds like modesty but is not. It is a very common habit. Much more common than people imagine." Before Eleanor could reply, the door opened again and Miss Harwood reappeared. She carried no papers now, only a small tray with a decanter and 2 glasses. The steadiness had returned to her movements, though there remained, to Eleanor's eye, a certain care in the way she set the tray down, as though she measured each action before committing to it. "I thought you might like a little sherry before supper," she said. "The evenings can feel longer here than one expects." "That is very kind," Eleanor said, "though I imagine you have quite enough to do without attending to us in person." Miss Harwood gave a small, almost apologetic smile. "One grows used to doing a little of everything. Mrs. Trevelyan's health has not been what it was, and the house, well, it has its demands." She poured the sherry with a precise hand. The liquid caught the green light from the lamp and turned it briefly into something darker, almost medicinal. Miss Marple accepted her glass but did not drink. "You've been here a long time, I think." "Nearly 10 years, said Miss Harwood. "Long enough to know where everything belongs, and where everything ought not to be," Miss Marple added lightly. Miss Harwood's hand paused for the smallest fraction of a moment as she set down the decanter. Then she said, "Yes, that as well." There was no awkwardness in her tone. If anything, it was too even, too carefully smoothed. Eleanor felt again that curious impression not of deceit exactly, but of something arranged, like a room tidied in haste before a visitor enters. From the hallway came the sound of footsteps on the staircase, slow, deliberate, and accompanied by the faintest hollow echo, as though each tread had been worn into a shallow curve by years of use. Eleanor turned instinctively toward the door. The staircase itself was not visible from the parlour, but she had passed it on entering the house. It was narrow, with a polished banister that dipped slightly at the centre, and each step bore the unmistakable hollow of a long habit, the mark left by countless feet choosing the same path without thinking. It had struck her then as a staircase that remembered more than it revealed. The footsteps descended now with a measured pace, not hurried, not hesitant, simply certain. "That will be Mrs. Trevelyan," Miss Harwood said quietly. "She does not often come down before supper, but perhaps she feels improved this evening." There was something in the way she said it, a faint tightening at the edges of the words that made Eleanor glance at her more closely. Miss Harwood's gaze had shifted toward the door, attentive but not expectant. Mrs. Trevelyan entered a moment later. She was a tall woman, though age had drawn her slightly forward at the shoulders, and she wore a dark dress that seemed chosen more for durability than elegance. Her face was lined, but not unkindly so, and her pale and sharp eyes moved quickly from one person to another, as though taking inventory. "Miss Marple," she said, with a brief inclination of the head, "and our new guest, I believe." "Mrs. Shaw," Eleanor supplied. "Yes, Shaw." Mrs. Trevelyan's gaze lingered for a moment longer than politeness required, then shifted away. "You will find the house comfortable enough, I trust. It has its inconveniences, but one cannot expect perfection in a place of this age." "On the contrary," Eleanor said, "I find it has a great deal of character." Mrs. Trevelyan gave a short, dry laugh. "Character is often what one calls it, when one has no intention of repairing it." Miss Marple smiled. "That is very true. In St. Mary Mead there was a cottage belonging to Mrs. Gillingham, which leaned so distinctly to one side that visitors felt obliged to adjust their posture upon entering. She always said it gave the place charm. It did in a way, though one could not help feeling that charm might one day collapse entirely." Mrs. Trevelyan's expression softened, though only slightly. "You have a way of putting things, Miss Marple." "I have lived a long time," Miss Marple replied. "One notices patterns." The conversation might have continued, but at that moment the door opened again, and Mr. Vale returned, accompanied by the man from the yard. Up close, he was younger than Eleanor had expected, perhaps in his late 30s, with a narrow face, bright eyes, and an energy that seemed to flicker just beneath the surface of his movements. "Allow me," said Vale smoothly. "Mr. Julian Peveril, whose name you may already know if you have any acquaintance with modern literature, and Miss Marple, Mrs. Shaw, Mrs. Trevelyan, and Miss Harwood, without whom we should all be lost in a sea of unpaid bills." Peveril bowed slightly, his smile quick and appraising. "I am delighted. There is something about an old inn that improves the company at once. One feels obliged to be interesting." "And are you?" Eleanor asked. Before she could stop herself, he laughed. "I do my best, madam. It is all any of us can do." As the conversation turned, Miss Harwood moved quietly to the sideboard, her presence receding without quite disappearing. Eleanor watched her for a moment, noting again that careful precision, the way each movement seemed measured against some internal standard. Then, without quite knowing why, she glanced back at the green-shaded lamp. The ledger was no longer open. It lay closed now, its cover drawn firmly shut, though Eleanor could not recall anyone touching it. The pool of light remained, but it illuminated nothing. Miss Marple followed her gaze. "How odd," Eleanor said softly. "I could have sworn—" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "So could I." She lifted her glass at last and took a small sip, her eyes still resting on the closed book. "One must always pay attention," she added, almost to herself, "to the moment when something ceases to be visible. It is very often more important than the moment when it first appears." From the staircase came a faint sound. Not footsteps this time, but something lighter, almost like the brushing of fabric against wood. No one else seemed to notice. And yet, for reasons she could not explain, Eleanor felt quite certain that the house itself had just altered in some small, irreversible way. Chapter 3. A conversation arranged. Too carefully. It was Miss Harwood who suggested they take tea in the disused music room. "Only until supper," she said, standing just inside the drawing-room door with a quiet decisiveness that did not quite match her otherwise yielding manner. "The fire in there draws better in damp weather, and Mrs. Trevelyan always preferred it for company before it fell out of regular use." No one questioned her. That, Eleanor noticed, was one of Miss Harwood's gifts she did not command. And yet arrangements settled around her as though they had been inevitable all along. They followed her through a narrow passage where the air changed perceptibly. The faint scent of polish and ash gave way to something greener, touched with damp leaves and the faint sharpness of crushed herbs. Somewhere nearby, unseen, the glass-roofed court Miss Harwood had mentioned must be breathing its quiet into the house. The music room lay at the back, its tall windows looking out over the stable yard. The curtains had been drawn halfway, leaving the lower panes exposed to the slow-gathering dusk. A pianoforte stood against the far wall, its lid closed, the varnish dulled in places where hands had once rested frequently, and then, gradually, not at all. "It has not been tuned in some time," Miss Harwood said, following Eleanor's glance, "though Mr. Vale insists it still holds its dignity." "Dignity is a curious thing," said Miss Marple, settling into a chair near the fire. "It can remain intact long after its usefulness has departed. There was a gentleman in St. Mary Mead, Major Wickford, who continued to wear his old regimentals to every public event, long after they had ceased to fit him properly. Everyone said it was touching. It was not, of course. It was rather sad, though no one liked to say so aloud. Mr. Vale laughed lightly as he took his place near the hearth. "You have a merciless clarity, Miss Marple. One almost hopes never to be described by you." "My dear Mr. Vale," she replied, "one is always being described by someone. It is merely that one does not often hear it." Julian Peveril had placed his leather case carefully on a side table, though not so far from his reach that he could not lay a hand upon it at a moment's notice. He remained standing, glancing from one person to another with an air of faint, contained restlessness. "I wonder," he said, "whether this room remembers music. One always hears that rooms retain something of what has passed within them." "They retain habits," said Miss Marple, "which is not quite the same thing. Music leaves very little behind, except in the minds of those who heard it. Habits, however, settle into corners and remain there for years." Mrs. Trevelyan had taken a chair near the window, where the dimming light outlined her profile in pale relief. "This room has seen a great deal," she said. "More than I care to catalogue. There was a time when it was the heart of the house. Now it is—" She stopped, as though the word she had intended no longer suited. "Waiting," Miss Harwood supplied quietly. Mrs. Trevelyan inclined her head. "Yes, that will do." Tea was brought in not by Miss Harwood this time, but by the porter Eleanor had seen in the yard. He moved with a cautious, deliberate tread, as though mindful of not disturbing something unseen. The tray rattled faintly in his hands, though whether from age or unease it was difficult to say. "Careful there, Jenkins," Vale said, without turning his head. "We should not like to have the good china sacrificed to the weather." Jenkins nodded, though he had not been addressed in a manner that invited reply. "Yes, sir, quite so, sir." As he set the tray down, his eyes flickered once toward the leather case on the side table, then away again. It was a small movement, easily missed. Eleanor saw it because she had begun, quite without intending to watch everyone more closely than she usually would. Miss Harwood poured the tea. Again, that precision is the careful measure of each cup, the slight pause before handing it over, as though confirming something privately before allowing the gesture to complete itself. "You must forgive the arrangements," she said. "We are not quite as we used to be. There are days when the house feels as though it is remembering its former self rather than inhabiting the present." "That happens to people as well," Miss Marple said gently. "In St. Mary Mead there was a lady named Mrs. Hargreaves, who continued to set a place at table for her brother long after he had moved to Australia. She said it helped her keep things in order. It did, in a way, though it also kept her from noticing that the rest of her life had altered around her." Miss Harwood's hand tightened very slightly on the teapot handle, then she set it down. "I suppose we all have our ways of not noticing," she said. The conversation drifted after that, as such conversations do, touching lightly on travel, on books, on the small inconveniences of weather and the larger inconveniences of modern life. Peveril spoke at some length about his manuscript, though he did so with a manner that suggested he was both eager to be admired and determined not to appear so. "It is, in essence," he said, "a study of identity, the ways in which we construct ourselves, and the dangers inherent in believing too completely in that construction." "How very interesting," said Miss Marple. "And do your characters succeed in being what they wish to be?" Peveril smiled, though there was something in it that did not quite reach his eyes. "Some of them. Others discover that the self they have created is less stable than they imagined." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "Yes, that is very often the case." Eleanor noticed that Mr. Vale had grown unusually still during this exchange. He sat with one hand resting lightly on the arm of his chair, his expression composed, attentive, and yet, beneath that composure, there was a tension, as though he were listening not only to the words being spoken, but to something beneath them. "You speak as though identity were a performance," Vale said after a moment. "I have always thought it rather more fixed than that. One is, in the end, what one has been." Peveril shrugged lightly. "That is one way of looking at it, though I should argue that what one has been is often less clear than one would prefer." Miss Harwood rose then, quite suddenly, and crossed to the window. She stood there with her back to the room, looking out into the gathering dark where the lantern in the yard cast a small, wavering circle of light. "Miss Harwood," Mrs. Trevelyan said, "is something the matter?" "No," she replied, "only the light. It changes very quickly here." It was an odd answer, not untrue perhaps, but incomplete. Miss Marple watched her for a moment, then turned her gaze to the piano. "It is curious," she said, "how often the things we no longer use tell the truest stories. That instrument, for instance. One can see exactly where the hands rested most often, and where they ceased to rest at all. It is not merely neglect, it is a kind of decision." Eleanor followed her gaze. The worn patches on the wood did indeed form a pattern, a map of past attention and present absence. "What sort of decision?" she asked. Miss Marple's eyes returned to her, mild and thoughtful, the sort that was not acknowledged as such at the time. One simply does not sit down to play, and then one does not sit down again, and after a while the absence becomes a habit. It is very difficult to reverse such things once they have settled. From the hallway came the faint sound of the bell again, just once. This time, Eleanor was certain she had heard it. The conversation faltered, though no one spoke of the interruption directly. Instead, there was a small shifting of a cup set down a fraction too firmly, a glance exchanged and then withdrawn, a breath taken and not quite released. Mr. Vale rose. "I believe," he said with that same easy fluency, "that we are being summoned to supper. One must not keep Mrs. Trevelyan's kitchen waiting, even if the kitchen itself has grown accustomed to patience." He moved toward the door, and the others followed. As Eleanor passed the side table, she glanced once more at the leather case. It was open, not wide, not conspicuously, just enough for the edge of a manuscript to show, its pages thick and closely written, and on the top page, visible for the briefest moment before the case shifted slightly under its own weight, there was a single word underlined twice in dark ink, "Not paid." The same words she had glimpsed earlier, the same careful, deliberate crossing out. She did not speak of it, but as they moved toward the dining room she became aware of something else. Something Miss Marple had said, lightly, almost in passing. One must always pay attention to the moment when something ceases to be visible, and now, quite without knowing when it had happened, Eleanor realized that Miss Harwood was no longer in the room behind them, nor, it seemed, had anyone seen her leave. Chapter 4. The place set too precisely. The dining room at the Lantern House Inn had been arranged with a care that was almost excessive. Eleanor noticed at once not the obvious things, such as the polished silver or the neatly folded napkins, but the precision. Each place setting lay at an exact distance from the edge of the table, each glass aligned so that its rim caught the light at the same angle. Even the chairs had been drawn out to an identical degree, as though someone had measured the space not merely for comfort but for symmetry. It gave the room a faintly theatrical quality, as though the dinner were less a meal than a scene to be played. "That is very well done," Eleanor said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. Miss Marple, who stood beside her, glanced along the table with mild approval. "Yes, very well done indeed, though one always wonders in such cases whether the person who arranged it finds comfort in the order, or requires it." "Requires it?" Eleanor repeated. "My dear Mrs. Shaw, there is a difference," Miss Marple said gently. "In St. Mary Mead there was a woman named Mrs. Belling who kept her drawing-room in such perfect order that visitors were afraid to sit down. She said it pleased her. It did not, of course. It prevented her from noticing that her husband had taken to spending his evenings elsewhere." Eleanor considered this, then looked again at the table. "You think this is not merely careful housekeeping?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that careful housekeeping does not usually extend to the exact alignment of every glass when there are other matters in the house that require attention. Before Eleanor could ask what those other matters might be, Mr. Vale entered, his presence filling the room with that same practiced ease. He took his place at the head of the table without hesitation, as though the position had been his by right for years rather than days. "Ah," he said, "perfection. Miss Harwood has outdone herself. One feels almost obliged to behave properly in such surroundings, though I cannot promise success." Julian Peveril laughed as he took the chair to Vale's right. "I should not trouble you too much. Perfection is rarely improved by human behaviour." Mrs. Trevelyan seated herself opposite Vale, her expression composed but watchful. Jenkins moved quietly around the table, adjusting a fork here, a glass there, though Eleanor could see that nothing truly required adjustment. "And Miss Harwood?" Eleanor asked before she could stop herself. "She will join us shortly," said Vale. "She has one or two final matters to attend to. The house, you understand, does not run itself, though one might wish it did." The meal began without her. Soup was served with a clear broth with a faint scent of thyme, the sort that seemed simple until one considered how precisely it must have been made. Conversation flowed, though not quite freely. There was a quality to it, a slight over-articulation, as though each person were choosing their words with a degree of care that exceeded ordinary politeness. Peveril spoke again of his manuscript, though this time with more detail. "It concerns a woman," he said, "who has constructed a life so entirely at odds with her beginnings that she ceases to remember which parts are invention and which are fact. The danger, of course, lies in the moment when someone else begins to see the seams." "And does that moment occur?" Eleanor asked. "It must," Peveril replied. "Otherwise there is no story." Miss Marple stirred her soup thoughtfully. "Stories are very particular about such things. Real life, I have found, is less obliging. There was a woman in St. Mary Mead, Miss Larkin, who passed herself off as the daughter of a minor baronet for nearly 20 years. No one questioned it, because she behaved exactly as they expected such a person to behave. It was only when she refused to attend a certain wedding that the truth began to come out, and even then many preferred not to see it." "Why did she refuse?" Eleanor asked. "Because the bride's family knew her as she had been," Miss Marple said, "and one cannot maintain two versions of oneself in the same room for very long. Something must give." Mr. Vale smiled faintly. "You make deception sound almost sympathetic, Miss Marple." "I make it sound human," she replied, "which is not quite the same thing." There was a brief pause, not silence exactly, but a moment in which the conversation lost its easy shape. Vale reached for his wine-glass, then set it down again without drinking. At that moment, Miss Harwood entered. She did not hurry, yet there was something in her manner that suggested she had come more quickly than she would have wished. Her expression was composed, her movements precise, but Eleanor saw at once that something had altered. The softness was still there, but beneath it lay a tension, fine as a wire drawn tight. "I hope I have not kept you waiting," she said. "Not at all," Vale replied smoothly. "We were merely discussing the nature of identity, which is always improved by the presence of someone who keeps accounts. Pray, sit down." Miss Harwood took her place at the far end of the table opposite Miss Marple. Jenkins moved to serve her, but she stopped him with a slight gesture. "I will take only a little," she said. "I have already eaten." "That will never do," Vale said lightly. "One must share in the communal experience, or the whole thing loses its point." Miss Harwood smiled. "I think the house will forgive me." It was said gently, but there was something in it that did not quite yield. The meal continued, plates were cleared, courses replaced. The conversation shifted, touching now on travel, now on books, now on the peculiarities of old houses. Yet beneath it all, Eleanor felt that same carefulness, as though each person were aware, at some level, that something had been introduced into the evening which could not easily be removed. At one point, Vale leaned back in his chair and regarded Miss Harwood with a thoughtful expression. "You manage everything here with remarkable efficiency," he said. "One might almost think you had been trained for it from birth." Miss Harwood met his gaze. "One learns what is necessary." "And what is necessary?" Vale asked. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Whatever prevents disorder." Vale laughed, but there was less ease in it than before. "A noble aim, though I suspect disorder has a way of asserting itself regardless of our efforts." "Only if it is allowed to," Miss Harwood said. Miss Marple set down her fork. "My dear," she said, in that same mild tone, "I once knew a woman in St. Mary Mead who kept her linen cupboard locked at all times. She said it was to prevent the maids from taking liberties. It was not, of course. It was to prevent herself from noticing that the sheets were wearing thin. Locking a thing away does not preserve it. It only delays the moment when one must look at it properly." Miss Harwood's hand, resting on the table, tightened slightly. "I am not sure that is always true," she said. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Not always, but often enough to be worth remembering." The final course was served as simple pudding, lightly sweet, with a hint of something sharper beneath the surface. Eleanor tasted it, and could not quite identify the flavour. "What is that?" she asked. "Quince," said Miss Harwood. "From the herb court. They do not keep well, so one must use them promptly." "Not paid," said Peveril suddenly, almost to himself. The words hung in the air. Eleanor felt her breath catch. Vale's head turned sharply. "I beg your pardon," he said. Peveril looked up as though surprised to find himself speaking aloud. "Nothing? Only a phrase that came to mind. It seemed appropriate somehow." "For what?" Vale asked. Peveril smiled, but there was a flicker of unease in it. "For the story, perhaps. One writes these things down, you see, and they have a way of returning at inconvenient moments." Miss Harwood had gone very still. Miss Marple watched her, her expression unchanged. "How curious," she said. "Words do have a way of returning, particularly when they have been written more than once." No one spoke for a moment. Then Vale laughed again, louder this time, as though to dispel the stillness. "Well, we must not let phrases dictate our evening. Mrs. Trevelyan, your cook has excelled herself. Miss Harwood, you have orchestrated the whole affair admirably. I propose we retire to the drawing-room for coffee." Chairs were pushed back. The careful arrangement of the table broke just slightly as each person moved away from their place. As Eleanor rose, she glanced once more at Miss Harwood. For a brief instant before the softness returned, she saw something else in the woman's face. Not fear, not exactly, but a kind of resolve, as though a decision, long delayed, had at last been made. And in that moment, Eleanor understood something she could not yet explain. The order of the room had not been created to welcome them. It had been created to hold something in place. And whatever that something was, it was no longer entirely contained. Chapter 5. The room that was not in use. Coffee was not served in the drawing-room. It was Miss Harwood who altered that arrangement so gently that no one could quite say when the change had been agreed upon. "The drawing-room fire is troublesome in damp weather," she said, standing with the coffee tray poised in her hands as though the matter were already settled. "It smokes rather disagreeably. The small back parlour is more comfortable this evening, I think." Mr. Vale hesitated just perceptibly. It was the first time Eleanor had seen him do so. "The back parlour?" he repeated, as though testing the words. "I had not thought—" "It has been aired," Miss Harwood said, "and the fire is already lit." There was nothing in her tone that invited disagreement. It was not insistence on something quieter than that. A statement placed so precisely that to move it would require more effort than anyone cared to expend. "Very well," Vale said after a moment, recovering himself with a smile that was just a fraction too quick. "Let us be guided by local knowledge. Lead the way, Miss Harwood." They followed her once more through the narrow passage, though this time the air felt different, heavier, perhaps, or closer. The faint herbal scent was still present, but it had been overtaken by something else, something older and less easily named. Eleanor thought of trunks kept closed too long, of rooms opened only when necessity required it. The back parlour was smaller than the drawing-room and lower in the ceiling. The fire burned steadily, but its warmth did not quite reach the corners, which remained in a soft, indistinct shadow. A single lamp stood on a side table, its shade pale rather than green, casting a flatter, less forgiving light. "This room is not often used," Mrs. Trevelyan said, taking her seat with a faint sound that might have been relief or resignation. "It was my husband's study once. After he did well, it seemed best to keep it as it was." Eleanor looked around. The room did indeed have the feeling of something preserved rather than lived in. Books lined the walls, but their arrangement was uneven, as though they had been returned to the shelves without much thought for order. A writing desk stood near the window, its surface clear except for a single inkstand and a blotter that had been turned over, hiding whatever had last been written there. Miss Marple took a chair near the fire and accepted her coffee with a nod of thanks. "It is always curious," she said, "how rooms retain a particular atmosphere even after their original purpose has gone. One does not need to be told what they were used for. It is simply there." Julian Peveril had not sat down. He moved slowly about the room, his gaze passing over the books, the desk, the mantelpiece with its arrangement of small, unremarkable objects that had somehow acquired significance merely by remaining in place. "There is a story here," he said. "One can feel it. Not in the obvious sense, but in the details. The way the desk has been cleared, for instance. That is never done without reason." "Everything is done for a reason," said Mr. Vale lightly, though his eyes had followed Peveril's glance to the desk. "The difficulty lies in determining which reasons matter." Miss Harwood set the tray down on a small table and began to pour the coffee. Again that careful precision. The cups were placed exactly, the sugar offered at the correct moment, the milk added only when requested. Eleanor watched her, and it seemed to her that Miss Harwood moved as one might move in a room filled with fragile objects, not merely careful, but aware that a single misjudged gesture might have consequences out of all proportion to the action itself. "You must be tired," Eleanor said, as Miss Harwood handed her a cup. "You have done a great deal this evening." Miss Harwood smiled, though it did not quite reach her eyes. "One does what is required. It is easier that way." "Easier than what?" Eleanor asked before she could stop herself. Miss Harwood hesitated just for a moment. Then she said, "Easier than allowing things to go unattended." Miss Marple stirred her coffee, though she did not drink it. In St. Mary Mead, she said, there was a gentleman named Mr. Darrow who kept a garden of the most extraordinary neatness. Every hedge trimmed, every path swept, not a leaf out of place. People admired it very much. They said it showed a fine sense of order. She paused, then added, it was only later that they understood he had begun to arrange the garden in that way after his wife left him. He said the order gave him peace. It did not, of course. It only gave him something to do instead of noticing the absence. No one spoke for a moment. Then Peveril said with a faint, strained laugh, you have a way of making the ordinary sound rather more complicated than one expects, Miss Marple. My dear Mr. Peveril, she replied gently, the ordinary is almost always more complicated than one expects. That is why people prefer not to look at it too closely. Mr. Vale rose and crossed to the mantelpiece, where he picked up a small object, a paper knife, Eleanor saw, its handle worn smooth by use. He turned it over in his hand, examining it as though it were something newly discovered. This belonged to Mrs. Trevelyan's husband, he said. A useful little thing. One wonders how many letters it has opened. Quite a number, Mrs. Trevelyan said. He had a great deal of correspondence. Business mostly. And personal letters? Vale asked. Mrs. Trevelyan's gaze sharpened. A few. Vale smiled, but there was something in it that did not sit easily. One always wonders, with letters, how much they reveal, or conceal. Miss Harwood's hand, resting lightly on the back of a chair, tightened. Letters are often misunderstood, she said. They say what is written, nothing more. And nothing less? Vale asked. She met his gaze. Nothing less. There was a tension in the room now, subtle but unmistakable. It lay beneath the conversation like a current beneath still water, felt rather than seen. Eleanor set her cup down on the table beside her. The coffee had cooled more quickly than she expected, or perhaps she'd simply not noticed the passing of time. Her gaze moved, almost without intention, to the writing desk. Something about it troubled her. Not the desk itself, nor the objects upon it, but the way it had been cleared. It was too complete, too deliberate. As though whatever had been there before had not merely been removed, but erased. Was there something on the desk earlier? She asked. The question seemed to catch the room off guard. Mrs. Trevelyan frowned slightly. Not that I recall. Why do you ask? Eleanor hesitated. I am not certain, only that it feels different. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the desk for a moment, then returned to Eleanor. Yes, she said quietly. Different is a useful word. It allows one to notice without yet understanding. Peveril had moved closer to the desk now. He leaned over it slightly, his fingers hovering just above the blotter. One might almost think, he said, that something has been written here and then removed, not merely taken away, but obliterated. Mr. Vale's voice cut in, smooth but firm. Surely that is a little fanciful. We must not begin to invent mysteries where none exist. Miss Harwood turned from the chair she had been holding and faced him fully. Perhaps, she said, but it is not always invention that creates mystery. There was a quiet in the room then, deeper than before, and into that quiet came the sound. Not the bell this time, a door closing, not nearby, but not distant either. Somewhere within the house a door had been shut with a firmness that suggested intention rather than accident. Everyone heard it. No one spoke. Miss Marple set her cup down with care. My dear Mrs. Trevelyan, she said, I wonder if you might tell me, does that door lead to the room that is not in use? Mrs. Trevelyan looked at her sharply. What room do you mean? Miss Marple smiled as though the question were of no consequence at all. The one, she said, that everyone in the house knows about and no one speaks of directly. Mrs. Trevelyan's gaze shifted just for a moment toward Miss Harwood, and in that moment Eleanor understood something with a clarity that startled her. There was, somewhere in the Lantern House Inn, a room that was not in use, and whatever had just been set in motion would lead them there. Chapter 6. The Key That Was Not Asked For. It was Mrs. Trevelyan who broke the silence, though not in the way Eleanor had expected. My dear Miss Marple, she said with a faint dryness, one could fill a house twice the size of this with rooms that are not in use. It is hardly an uncommon feature in a place of this age. Her tone was reasonable, entirely so, yet it carried with it a slight edge not of annoyance, but of something more deliberate. A boundary, perhaps, drawn with care and meant to hold. Miss Marple inclined her head as though the point were entirely accepted. Indeed, she said, and yet one finds that certain unused rooms acquire a kind of importance beyond their function, not because of what they are, but because of what is not said about them. Mrs. Trevelyan did not reply immediately. Instead, she reached for her coffee, though Eleanor noticed that she did not drink. Her fingers rested on the cup as though it anchored her to the moment. Importance, she said at last, is often a matter of perspective. What appears significant to one person may be of no consequence to another. Quite true, Miss Marple agreed. Though I have always found that what people avoid discussing tends to reveal rather more than what they speak of freely. Mr. Vale rose again, this time with a more definite energy, as though determined to reassert the shape of the evening. Well, he said, We are in danger of becoming positively introspective, which is hardly suitable for a gathering intended to be pleasant. Miss Harwood, I wonder if you might show Mrs. Shaw the herb court. It is one of the more charming features of the house, and I am told the scent of it is particularly noticeable after rain. It was offered lightly, but Eleanor sensed the intention behind it, a redirection, a dispersal. Miss Harwood hesitated, only briefly, but enough. The herb court, she said. Yes, of course. If Mrs. Shaw would like... I should be delighted, Eleanor said, rising before she could reconsider. Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded lightly in her lap. I think I shall stay by the fire, she said. Old bones, you know. They prefer consistency. Her eyes met Eleanor's for a moment. Not a warning, not quite, but something close to it. Do observe carefully, she added, almost as an afterthought. Houses often speak most clearly when one is not looking directly at them. Eleanor nodded, though she was not entirely certain what she was meant to observe. Miss Harwood led the way out of the back parlour and down the narrow passage once more. The air grew cooler as they moved, and the faint herbal scent strengthened, mingling now with the dampness that crept in from the outer walls. You must forgive the house, Miss Harwood said as they walked. It can feel confusing to those not accustomed to it. I find it interesting, Eleanor replied, though I confess I am not always certain where I am. That is quite natural, Miss Harwood said. The layout is not straightforward. It has been altered many times over the years, and not always with a clear plan. They reached a small door at the end of the passage. Miss Harwood opened it, and a rush of cool, damp air greeted them. The herb court lay beneath a glass roof, its panes clouded with condensation. The ground was paved with uneven stone, and along the walls grew a variety of plants. Rosemary, thyme, sage, their leaves darkened by the rain, and releasing their scent into the enclosed space. In the centre stood a low stone table, its surface wet and faintly reflective. It is very beautiful, Eleanor said. Yes, Miss Harwood replied. It was my idea to restore it. When I first came here, it had been neglected for some time. You have done a great deal for the house, Eleanor said. Miss Harwood gave a small, almost dismissive gesture. Only what was necessary. They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the soft drip of water from the glass above. Do you like it here? Eleanor asked. Miss Harwood did not answer at once. She moved toward the stone table and placed her hand upon it, as though testing its solidity. It is familiar, she said at last. One grows accustomed to a place, and after a while it becomes difficult to imagine being elsewhere. That is not quite the same as liking it, Eleanor said gently. Miss Harwood's hand remained on the stone. No, she said. It is not. There was something in her voice, a quiet strain, quickly controlled, that made Eleanor hesitate before speaking again. You seemed concerned earlier, she said, at dinner, when that phrase was mentioned. Miss Harwood turned to her. What phrase? Not paid, Eleanor said. It appeared to have some significance. For a moment, Miss Harwood's expression did not change. Then, very slowly, the softness returned, settling over her features like a veil. It is only an accounting term, she said. Nothing more. And yet, Eleanor said, you seemed... I seemed what? Miss Harwood asked, her tone still gentle, but with a firmness beneath it. Eleanor hesitated, as though it mattered. Miss Harwood smiled. Everything matters, she said. That is the difficulty. Before Eleanor could reply, there was a sound behind them. A footstep, not in the passage they had come through, but somewhere beyond the herb court, perhaps on the other side of the wall, or in a corridor that ran parallel to it. It was a light step, but distinct. Miss Harwood's head turned sharply. Did you hear that? Eleanor asked. Yes, Miss Harwood said. She moved quickly to the far side of the court, where a second door stood, one Eleanor had not noticed before. It was smaller than the first, its wood darker, its handle worn. Miss Harwood reached for the handle, then stopped. For a moment she stood there, her hand hovering just above it. Then she drew back. It is nothing, she said. The house settles. Eleanor did not believe her. Does that door lead somewhere? She asked. Miss Harwood's hand dropped to her side. It leads to a corridor, she said. And beyond that other rooms. Rooms that are not in use, Eleanor said. Miss Harwood's gaze met hers. Yes, she said. Rooms that are not in use. There was a pause. Then, without quite knowing why, Eleanor said, You have the key. It was not a question. Miss Harwood did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her dress and drew out a small ring of keys, the same Eleanor had seen earlier. She held them for a moment, the metal catching the dim light from above. Yes, she said, I have the key. Will you show me? Eleanor asked. Miss Harwood looked at her. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Miss Harwood said, very quietly, No. It was not refusal in the ordinary sense. There was no sharpness in it, no impatience, only a certainty, as though the answer had been decided long before the question was asked. Why not? Eleanor said. Miss Harwood closed her hand around the keys. Because, she said, some rooms are not meant to be opened. And yet, Eleanor said, You have the key? Miss Harwood's gaze did not waver. Yes, she said, I have the key. The words settled between them, heavy with something unspoken. Then, from somewhere within the house, there came another sound. Not a door this time. A voice, raised, sharp, and unmistakably Mr. Vale's. "Miss Harwood," he called. "Miss Harwood, where are you?" Miss Harwood turned at once, the keys slipping back into her pocket. "We must go back," she said. There was something in her tone now that Eleanor had not heard before: urgency, edged with something very close to fear. They moved quickly through the passage and into the back parlour. Mr. Vale stood by the writing desk, his expression altered. The ease was gone. In its place was something harder, more intent. "Where have you been?" he said. "I've been looking for you." "I was showing Mrs. Shaw the herb court," Miss Harwood replied. Vale's gaze flicked to Eleanor, then back to Miss Harwood. "Of course," he said. "How very thoughtful." There was paper on the desk, not the blotter, a single sheet, placed squarely in the centre. Eleanor recognised it at once. A column of names, and beside one of them, written clearly in dark ink, "Not paid." Miss Harwood saw it too, and for the first time since Eleanor had met her, the careful control slipped, only for a second, but in that second, everything changed. Chapter 7. The name that would not sit quietly. No one spoke at once. The paper lay on the desk with an insistence that made it seem less like an object and more like an interruption, something that had forced its way into the room and now refused to be ignored. The lamplight, pale and level in this smaller parlour, fell directly across it, leaving no corner of the page in shadow. Eleanor did not move closer, yet she could see enough. A list of names, not many, perhaps 6 or 7, written in a careful, narrow hand. Beside most of them, neat marks, small ticks, or faint notations that suggested settlement, completion, an end of obligation. But beside one name, the lowest on the page, the word stood out with an almost violent clarity. "Not paid." Struck through once, then again. Miss Harwood's gaze fixed on it. It was not merely attention, it was recognition. "You've been going through my accounts," she said. Her voice was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that had been arranged, as the table had been arranged, as the house itself seemed arranged carefully, deliberately, and with effort. Mr. Vale leaned one hand lightly on the desk. His posture relaxed, though Eleanor saw now that the relaxation was something he had put on rather than something he felt. "My dear Miss Harwood," he said, "I should hardly call it going through. One merely takes an interest in the workings of a place one is inhabiting. It is a natural curiosity." "It is not your place to satisfy it," Miss Harwood replied. There was no rise in her tone, no outward sign of challenge. Yet the words did not yield. Julian Peveril had moved closer now, though he remained just to one side, as though unwilling to place himself directly within the exchange. His eyes flicked from the paper to Miss Harwood, then to Vale, with an intensity that bordered on fascination. "I suppose," he said with a faint attempt at lightness, "that all houses have their private ledgers. One simply does not expect to see them brought into the open quite so dramatically." Mrs. Trevelyan had not risen from her chair, but her attention was entirely fixed upon the desk. "That paper was not there before," she said. "No," Vale replied, "it was not." "And now it is," she said. "Yes." There was a pause, not empty but weighted. Miss Marple rose then, not hurriedly, but with a quiet deliberation that seemed to alter the shape of the room more effectively than any raised voice could have done. She crossed to the desk and stood beside it, her hands folded lightly before her. "May one?" she asked. It was not directed at anyone in particular, yet it required an answer. Miss Harwood did not speak. Mr. Vale gave a small, almost amused inclination of his head. "By all means." Miss Marple looked down at the paper. For a moment she said nothing. Then she lifted her eyes, not to Vale, but to Miss Harwood. "How very careful," she said, "and how very final." Miss Harwood's fingers closed slightly, as though around something invisible. "It is an account," she said. "Nothing more." Miss Marple's gaze returned to the page. "Accounts are rarely nothing more, my dear. They have a way of accumulating meaning, quite apart from their sums. In St. Mary Mead there was a solicitor, Mr. Kettering, who kept his records with the utmost precision. Every debt, every payment, every small obligation noted and resolved. People said he was a model of order." She paused, then added gently, "It was only later that they understood he had been using those records not to settle matters, but to remember them. Every slight, every disappointment, every perceived injustice. He said he was balancing accounts. He was not, of course. He was preserving them." No one interrupted her. Miss Harwood's gaze had not left the paper. "This is not the same," she said. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "It is not." There was something in the way she said it, a quiet acknowledgement rather than contradiction that made Eleanor's breath catch. Mr. Vale straightened slightly. "I think," he said, "that we are in danger of assigning a great deal of significance to what is, in essence, a simple notation. Not paid. It could refer to anything. A bill overlooked, a debt delayed. There is no need to embroider it with unnecessary speculation." "And yet you brought it here," Miss Marple said. Vale smiled, though it did not quite hold. "I found it here," he said. Miss Harwood's head lifted. "That is not true," she said. Her voice was still calm, but the calm had changed. It was no longer arranged. It was held. You did not find it here. You brought it. Vale's smile thinned. My dear Miss Harwood, you place me in a most awkward position. I assure you I have done nothing of the sort. Then how did it come to be here? She asked. That, Vale said, with a slight lift of his shoulders, is precisely what I should like to know. There was a faint movement at the edge of the room. Jenkins, who had remained near the door, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His eyes flickered toward the desk, then away again. You saw something, Eleanor said suddenly. It was not a question. Jenkins started slightly. No, ma'am. No, nothing of the kind. You looked at the paper when you came in, Eleanor said. You recognized it. I did not, he began, then stopped. Miss Marple turned her head, her gaze resting on him with quiet interest. My dear man, she said, it is always best to say what one knows at once. It saves a great deal of trouble later on. Jenkins swallowed. I only saw it for a moment, he said. When I came to clear the cups, it was already there. Already there, Miss Harwood repeated. Yes. Miss? And you did not think to mention it? Jenkins hesitated. I did not think it was my place. That is a very common difficulty, Miss Marple said. People are so often uncertain of their place when it comes to speaking the truth. Mr. Vale gave a short laugh. Well, there we are, he said. The mystery resolves itself. The paper was placed here by some unknown hand, and we are all equally in the dark. A charming little puzzle, but hardly one to disturb our evening. Miss Marple did not move. No, she said, not equally in the dark. The word settled with a quiet certainty. Miss Harwood looked at her. What do you mean? She asked. Miss Marple's gaze returned to the paper. I mean, she said, that the significance of this page does not lie in the words themselves, but in the fact that they have been written twice. Eleanor felt a sudden sharp clarity, struck through once, then again. Why twice? She said. Miss Marple smiled, not at her but at the thought itself, because once was not enough, she said. Once might have been an error or a hesitation, twice is a decision. Miss Harwood's hand moved almost involuntarily toward her pocket. The keys. Eleanor saw the motion, though it was quickly checked. Then someone, Peveril said slowly, has decided that whatever this refers to is unfinished. Or unresolved, Miss Marple said. Mr. Vale's expression had changed again. The ease had not returned. Really, he said, this is becoming excessively abstract. We are discussing a mark on a page as though it were a matter of life and death. Miss Marple turned to him. My dear Mr. Vale, she said gently, one finds, very often, that such marks are exactly that. There was silence then, not empty, not waiting, simply there. And in that silence, Eleanor became aware of something else. The house. It still wasn't. Not entirely. Somewhere above them, or perhaps beyond the walls of the room, there was a faint irregular sound, not footsteps, not quite, but something moving, something that did not settle. She glanced toward the door. Did anyone else hear? She began. The sound came again, closer this time, a soft, dragging movement, then a stop. Miss Harwood's face had gone very pale. That, she said, is not the house settling. No one spoke. The sound came once more, and this time it was unmistakable. Something or someone was moving in the corridor beyond the door, and it was coming toward them. Chapter 8. What the corridor carried forward. No one moved to open the door. That, Eleanor would remember later, was the first true indication that something had shifted from discomfort into something more serious. In an ordinary house, at an ordinary hour, a sound in the corridor would be answered at once by curiosity, if nothing else. But here, in the small back parlour, each person seemed to hesitate at the same instant, as though some shared instinct had suggested that opening the door would not simplify matters. The sound came again, not hurried, not even particularly loud. A measured movement, uneven only in its rhythm, a faint drag, followed by a step, then a pause that lingered just long enough to feel intentional. Miss Harwood did not look at the others. Her eyes remained fixed on the door. That should not be, she said, very quietly. Mr. Vale's expression hardened. Jenkins, he said, without raising his voice, go and see what it is. Jenkins did not move at once. His gaze flicked toward Miss Harwood, then back to Vale. Yes, sir, he said finally, though there was no conviction in it. He crossed the room with a careful tread, as though each step might alter something. When he reached the door, he paused, his hand hovering over the handle. Best open it, Vale said, with a firmness that allowed no retreat. Jenkins nodded, swallowed, and turned the handle. The door opened inward. The corridor beyond lay dimly lit by a single wall lamp, its light uneven, casting long shadows along the narrow passage. For a moment, there was nothing. Then the movement was resolved. A figure stood halfway down the corridor. It was not immediately clear who it was. The light fell at an angle that obscured the face, leaving only the outline of a man, perhaps slightly bent at the shoulders, one hand trailing along the wall as though for balance. Eleanor, Miss Marple said softly without turning her head, do observe the hand. Eleanor did. The hand moved with a curious hesitation, as though it were not entirely certain of its own strength. The fingers brushed the wall, then lifted, then returned again, not searching exactly, but testing. "Who is there?" Vale called. The figure did not answer at once. Instead, it took another step forward with the same uneven rhythm, the same slight drag. Then, as it moved into clearer light, Eleanor felt a sudden, sharp recognition. "Mr. Vale," she began, but it was already evident. Ambrose Vale stood in the corridor, or rather Ambrose Vale's body did. The man in the room had not moved. For a moment, Eleanor could not reconcile the two images. Vale, standing beside the desk, composed, alert, and Vale, in the corridor, moving toward them with that strange, uncertain gait. Then the truth resolved itself. The man in the corridor was not Vale. He only resembled him. Julian Peveril stepped forward into the light. His face, pale and strained, bore a fleeting resemblance to Vale's in the way certain expressions aligned a similarity that had gone unnoticed until now, when it appeared almost grotesque in its clarity. "Forgive me," Peveril said, his voice unsteady. "I thought I heard something." "You were not in the room," Vale said sharply. "I stepped out," Peveril replied. "Only for a moment. I needed air." Miss Marple's gaze rested on him. "And you found it in the corridor?" she asked gently. Peveril hesitated. "Yes. I mean, no, not exactly. I heard a sound, and I thought—" "You thought what?" Miss Marple asked. "That someone was there," he said. "And was there?" Peveril's eyes flicked toward the far end of the corridor, then back again. "I am not sure," he said. Miss Harwood moved then, stepping past Jenkins and into the doorway. Her gaze followed the line of the corridor, sharp and intent. "There is no one there now," she said. "Now," Miss Marple repeated softly. The words seemed to settle. Peveril entered the room, closing the distance between himself and the others, with a movement that was quicker than before, almost abrupt. "I must apologize," he said. "I did not mean to cause alarm. It was only one of those impressions one has in unfamiliar places." "Impressions," Vale said with a faint edge. "Yes, they do have a way of complicating matters." Miss Harwood remained in the doorway. "Eleanor," Miss Marple said quietly, "what did you notice first?" The question seemed oddly placed, yet Eleanor answered without hesitation. "The hand," she said. "The way it moved." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "That is often the most revealing thing. Faces can arrange themselves. Hands are less disciplined." Peveril's expression tightened, though he attempted to smile. "I assure you," he said, "my hands are entirely under my control." Miss Marple's gaze rested on him for a moment longer, then shifted away. "I'm sure they are," she said. Miss Harwood turned back into the room. "We should close the door," she said. "There is nothing to be gained by leaving it open." Jenkins did so at once, the latch falling into place with a small, decisive sound. The room felt different now, more enclosed, more deliberate. Mr. Vale returned to his position by the desk, though he did not resume his earlier ease. His attention moved between Miss Harwood and Peveril with a focus that suggested calculation. "This is becoming unnecessarily theatrical," he said. "A sound in the corridor, a momentary absence, a misplaced paper. We are allowing coincidence to take on the appearance of design." "Coincidence rarely arranges itself so neatly," Miss Marple said. "Neatly?" Vale repeated. "Yes," she said. "Everything this evening has been very neatly arranged. The table, the conversation, the movements from one room to another. It is only now that the arrangement is beginning to shift." Miss Harwood's gaze dropped, just for a moment, to the paper on the desk. "Perhaps it was never as neat as it appeared," she said. Peveril laughed, though there was no humour in it. "I begin to feel," he said, "as though I have stepped into my own manuscript. Identity, arrangement, hidden truths. One could almost admire the symmetry, if it were not so unsettling." Miss Marple looked at him. "My dear Mr. Peveril," she said gently, "symmetry is often the most misleading thing of all. It suggests balance, where there is none." Eleanor moved closer to the desk. The paper lay as before, unchanged, yet something about it seemed different now, not in its appearance, but in its presence, as though it had moved from being an object to being a statement. "Miss Harwood," she said, "this name—" She stopped. The name itself seemed suddenly more significant than the words beside it. "Who is it?" she asked. Miss Harwood did not answer. Instead, she reached into her pocket and drew out the ring of keys once more. For a moment she held them, the metal catching the light. Then she looked at Miss Marple. "You knew," she said. It was not an accusation. Not quite. Miss Marple met her gaze. "I suspected," she said. "There is a difference." Miss Harwood nodded, as though acknowledging something already decided. "Yes," she said. "There is." She turned toward the door. "I think," she said, "it is time you saw the room that is not in use." Mr. Vale stepped forward. "That will not be necessary," he said. Miss Harwood did not look at him. "Yes," she said, "it will." The keys shifted in her hand, and this time, when she moved toward the door, no one tried to stop her, because they all understood, though none of them had yet said it aloud. Whatever lay behind that locked room was no longer something that could remain unseen. Chapter 9. The room that had been kept whole. The passage beyond the herb court felt narrower the second time. Eleanor could not have said whether it was the walls themselves or the awareness of where it led that altered the space, but the effect was unmistakable. The air seemed closer, the faint scent of rosemary and damp stone sharpened into something almost metallic, as though the house, having held its breath for some time, had begun at last to exhale. Miss Harwood walked ahead, the ring of keys held not tightly, but with a steadiness that suggested long familiarity. She did not hurry. That, more than anything else, unsettled Eleanor. There was no hesitation now, no moment of pause before the second door, only a quiet certainty. Behind them, the others followed. Mr. Vale came immediately after Miss Harwood, his presence close enough to suggest vigilance rather than curiosity. Peveril lingered a step behind him, his earlier energy subdued into something watchful, almost strained. Mrs. Trevelyan moved with care, one hand lightly on the wall, as though the act of walking this passage required more from her than she wished to admit. Jenkins brought up the rear, his footsteps cautious, his gaze lowered. Miss Marple walked beside Eleanor. "My dear," she said softly, "do remember what you noticed earlier." "The hand," Eleanor whispered. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "and the fact that certain movements do not match the explanations given for them." Eleanor nodded, though the meaning was not yet fully clear. They reached the door. It was, as Eleanor remembered, smaller than the others, its wood darker, its surface marked by the faint wear of long use. The handle bore the polished dullness of something touched often, though not recently. Miss Harwood stopped. For a moment she stood there, the keys resting in her palm, then she selected one. The motion was precise, not uncertain, not searching. She knew which key it was without looking. "That," Miss Marple murmured, "is always interesting." Eleanor glanced at her. "What is?" "When a person does not need to try the keys," Miss Marple said. "It suggests a habit rather than an occasional necessity." Miss Harwood inserted the key into the lock. The sound made a small metallic turn that seemed louder than it ought to have been. It carried down the passage, settling into the walls. She opened the door. The room beyond was not what Eleanor had expected. It was not dusty, not neglected, not even particularly old in appearance. It was preserved. The air inside held the faint, unmistakable scent of linen, kept too long in enclosed spaces not unpleasant, but static, as though time had been allowed to settle without disturbance. The curtains were drawn, but not entirely. A narrow gap admitted a pale line of evening light that fell across the centre of the room. There was a bed, a narrow one neatly made, the coverlet smooth, the pillows arranged with a care that bordered on reverence. A small table stood beside it, upon which rested a glass, empty but clean, and a folded cloth placed with exact alignment. Against the far wall stood a wardrobe, its doors closed. A chair, simple and straight-backed, had been positioned beside it. Nothing in the room appeared out of place. Nothing appeared unused. "This is not abandoned," Eleanor said. "No," Miss Harwood replied. Her voice was steady. "It is not." Mrs. Trevelyan stepped forward, her gaze moving slowly around the room. "This room was closed," she said. "After my husband died, it was not to be opened again." "And yet it has been," Miss Marple said gently. Miss Harwood did not look at her. "Yes," she said, "it has." Mr. Vale moved into the room, his expression intent. "And for what purpose?" he asked. Miss Harwood turned to face him. "For the same purpose it always had," she said. "And that is?" Vale pressed. She held his gaze. "To keep something in order." There was silence. Not empty, not uncertain, simply waiting. Eleanor stepped further into the room. There was something here not visible, not immediately definable, but present. A sense of continuation, as though the room had not been closed at all but had simply withdrawn from the rest of the house. Her gaze moved to the table beside the bed, the glass, the cloth, and beside them, a small folded paper. Her breath caught. "Miss Harwood," she said, "what is this?" Miss Harwood did not answer at once. Instead, she crossed the room and picked up the paper. For a moment she held it, her fingers resting lightly against its edges. Then she unfolded it. Eleanor saw the writing at once. The same careful hand, the same narrow lines, a list of names, and beside one of them, "Not paid." But this time, the words were not struck through. They stood alone, unaltered. Peveril stepped closer. "That is the same phrase," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "but not the same meaning." Mr. Vale's voice sharpened. "This is absurd," he said. "A piece of paper, a notation repeated. You are building significance where there is none." Miss Marple looked at him. "My dear Mr. Vale," she said, "it is not the repetition that matters. It is the difference." Miss Harwood folded the paper again. "This was here before," she said. "In this room?" Eleanor asked. "Yes." "And the other paper?" Eleanor said. "The one in the parlour?" Miss Harwood's gaze did not waver. "That one," she said, "was moved." There was a pause. Then Miss Marple said, very quietly, "By whom?" Miss Harwood did not answer. Instead she turned and looked at the bed. Eleanor followed her gaze. At first she saw nothing unusual, then a slight indentation, not deep, not recent, but present, as though someone had sat there or lay there not long ago. Mrs. Trevelyan's breath caught. "This room has not been used," she said. "It cannot have been—" "It has," Miss Harwood said. Her voice was no longer entirely steady. "It has been used." Mr. Vale took a step forward. "This is nonsense," he said. "No one has been here. The door was locked." Miss Harwood looked at him. "I have the key," she said. "Yes," Vale replied. "You do." The words hung between them. Eleanor felt a sudden, sharp clarity. "You have been coming here," she said. Miss Harwood did not deny it. "Yes," she said. "Why?" Eleanor asked. Miss Harwood's gaze moved once more around the room. "To keep it as it was," she said. "And has it remained so?" Miss Marple asked. Miss Harwood hesitated. Then very quietly, "No," she said. The answer settled. Heavy. Irreversible. From somewhere deeper in the house, a faint sound echoed. Not a bell. Not a footstep. Something else. A dull, final noise, as though something had fallen or been dropped. Mr. Vale turned sharply. "What was that?" he said. No one answered. But in that moment, Eleanor understood something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. The room had not been kept whole. It had been kept waiting, and whatever had just happened had ended that waiting. Chapter 10. What was dropped and what was understood. No one spoke for several seconds after the sound. It was not a dramatic noise, not the sort that announces catastrophe in any theatrical way. It had been dull, containing something falling not from height, but from a hand. Yet in the narrow room, preserved so carefully against time, the sound carried a finality that made it impossible to dismiss. Miss Harwood did not move at once. That, more than anything else, told Eleanor that she understood it. "We must go back," Mr. Vale said sharply, but his voice had altered. It no longer arranged the moment. It responded to it. Miss Marple, however, did not turn toward the door immediately. She looked instead at the bed, then at the small table, and finally at Miss Harwood. "Yes," she said gently, "we must." They left the room as they had entered it, though not in the same order. This time, Miss Harwood did not lead. She followed, her hand still resting lightly on the folded paper she had taken from the table. The passage seemed longer now. Eleanor became aware of the sound of their footsteps, the faint echo of them against the stone, the way the air shifted as they moved. It was not merely the house that felt altered, it was their relation to it. Something had been set in motion, and now something has concluded. They reached the back parlour. The door stood open. Jenkins, who had been the last to leave earlier, had not returned with them. "Jenkins?" Mrs. Trevelyan called. There was no answer. Mr. Vale stepped forward first, then stopped. Eleanor saw his expression change, not dramatically, not outwardly, but in a small, unmistakable way. The control did not vanish. It slipped. "What is it?" Peveril asked. Vale did not reply. Miss Marple moved past him. Eleanor followed. Jenkins lay on the floor beside the desk. He was not arranged. That was the first thing Eleanor noticed. He lay as he had fallen, one arm bent awkwardly beneath him, the other extended toward the desk, his fingers just short of touching its edge. His cap had slipped to one side, and his eyes, open but unseeing, fixed on nothing at all. There was no blood, no visible mark, only stillness. Mrs. Trevelyan made a small sound, not quite a cry, not quite a word. "Is he?" Peveril began. Miss Marple knelt beside the man. She did not touch him at once. She observed. Then gently she placed her fingers at his wrist. A moment passed. Then she withdrew her hand. "I am afraid," she said quietly, "that he is beyond our assistance." The words settled into the room. Mr. Vale drew in a breath. "This is—" he began, then stopped. "This is extraordinary." Miss Marple rose. "No," she said, "it is not." Her gaze moved to the desk. The paper lay where it had been. The column of names, the words, "not paid," still struck through, still final. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air. "This cannot be a coincidence," she said. "No," Miss Marple replied. "It is not." Peveril stepped back, his face pale. "This is absurd," he said. "A man collapses, and we what? We connect it to a phrase on a piece of paper?" Miss Marple turned to him. "My dear Mr. Peveril," she said gently, "it is not the phrase that connects them. It is the sequence." Mr. Vale had recovered some of his composure. "We must send for a doctor," he said, "at once." Mrs. Trevelyan. "I will send someone," Mrs. Trevelyan said, though her voice lacked its earlier firmness. "There is no need to hurry unduly," Miss Marple said. Vale looked at her sharply. "No need," he repeated. "The man is dead." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and whatever caused it has already done its work." There was something in her tone, not coldness, not indifference, but certainty that stilled the room. Eleanor moved closer to the desk. There was something she had not yet understood, something that had been present from the beginning. The ledger, the paper, the phrase, "not paid." "Miss Marple," she said, "you said earlier that the significance lies in the fact that it was written twice." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "and that twice is a decision." "Yes." Eleanor looked at the paper again, "And this one," she said, "has been struck through twice." "Yes." "And the one in the other room," she continued, "was not struck through at all." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Quite so." Eleanor felt the pieces begin to shift. "Then one represents something concluded," she said slowly, "and the other something not yet settled," Miss Marple said. "Yes," Eleanor said, "settled." Mr. Vale gave a short, dismissive laugh. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You're constructing a narrative out of nothing. A man has died. That is the only fact that matters." Miss Marple looked at him. "My dear Mr. Vale," she said, "facts rarely stand alone. They are part of a pattern, whether we choose to see it or not." She turned her gaze to Jenkins. "He saw something," she said. Eleanor nodded. "He admitted as much. And then," Miss Marple continued, "he returned here, to this room, to this desk." "Yes," Eleanor said. "And something occurred," Miss Marple said. Peveril shifted uneasily. "What are you suggesting?" he asked. "What was he?" Silenced. Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she moved to the desk. Her fingers hovered over the paper. Then she did something very simple. She turned it over. The underside was blank. But the movement revealed something else. A faint impression. The pressure of writing from another page. Miss Marple leaned closer. "Yes," she said softly. "That is what I thought." Eleanor stepped beside her. "What is it?" Miss Marple looked up. "An earlier entry," she said. "Pressed through from the page above, the same hand, the same list." "And the same phrase?" Eleanor asked. Miss Marple met her gaze. "No," she said, "not the same." Eleanor felt her breath catch. "Then what?" she asked. Miss Marple's expression did not change. "It was paid," she said. The words seemed to alter the air. Mr. Vale's gaze sharpened. "That proves nothing," he said quickly. "An account settled. A notation corrected. There is nothing remarkable in that." "No," Miss Marple said. "Not in itself." She turned back to the paper. "But when one considers that the earlier entry read paid, and the later one reads not paid, and that the latter has been struck through twice," she paused, then finished very quietly, "one begins to wonder who decided that the account had not in fact been settled." The room held that thought. Eleanor looked at Miss Harwood. She had not moved. Her hand still held the folded paper from the preserved room. Her gaze rested not on Jenkins, not on the desk, but Mr. Vale, and in that gaze Eleanor saw something she had not fully understood before. Not fear, not uncertainty, but recognition, as though something long known had finally been confirmed. Miss Marple followed her gaze. "Yes," she said softly, "I think we are very close now." Mr. Vale straightened. "I think," he said, "that we are indulging in speculation at a moment when practical action is required. A man is dead. That is the fact before us." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said, "and another will be, if we do not understand why." The words fell into the room with quiet weight. No one spoke, because for the first time they all understood that this was not the end of something. It was the continuation, and whatever had just been dropped had not yet finished its work. Chapter 11. What was known before, it was said. It was Miss Marple who moved first, not toward the door, nor toward Jenkins, but toward the fire. She stood there a moment, warming her hands in a gesture so ordinary that it seemed almost inappropriate, and yet, in that very ordinariness, something settled. The room, which had been poised between reaction and denial, began to take shape again, not as it had been before, but as something more deliberate. "My dear Mrs. Trevelyan," she said, without turning, "it would be best if someone were sent for the doctor now, not because it will alter matters, but because it will allow them to proceed properly." Mrs. Trevelyan nodded, as though grateful for the clarity of instruction. "Yes," she said. "Yes, of course." She moved toward the door, her steps careful but purposeful, and left the room without further word. The remaining 5 stood in a silence that was no longer uncertain. It had become, Eleanor realized, expectant. Miss Marple turned back. "I think," she said, "that we have all seen enough now to understand that this is not an accident, nor is it an isolated occurrence." Peveril shifted, his unease no longer disguised. "You speak as though this had been planned," he said. Miss Marple regarded him with mild interest. "My dear Mr. Peveril, most things of this kind are. The question is not whether there was a plan, but when it began." Mr. Vale gave a short, controlled laugh. "And you propose to determine that here and now, without evidence, without inquiry, based on nothing more than impressions and phrases?" Miss Marple smiled. "On the contrary," she said, "based on observation, which is often more reliable than either evidence or inquiry, particularly when those are arranged after the fact." Eleanor felt the shift then. It was not a confrontation. Miss Marple did not confront, but something in the room had aligned itself around her. "You said earlier," Eleanor said, "that the significance lies in the sequence, that this was not the beginning." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Then what was?" Eleanor asked. Miss Marple's gaze moved, not to the desk, but to Miss Harwood. "My dear," she said gently, "you have been keeping something in order for a very long time." Miss Harwood did not look away. "Yes," she said, "and you have done so with great care," Miss Marple continued. So much care that one might almost believe it was done out of habit rather than necessity. Miss Harwood's fingers tightened slightly around the folded paper she still held. It was necessary, she said. Yes, Miss Marple said. At first. There was a pause. Then, very quietly. But not in the way it is now. Mr. Vale stepped forward. This is absurd, he said. You're turning an inn's bookkeeper into some sort of tragic heroine, when the fact remains that a man lies dead on the floor, and we have yet to establish— You have established it, Miss Marple said. Her tone did not rise. It did not need to. Mr. Vale stopped. I beg your pardon, he said. Miss Marple looked at him. My dear Mr. Vale, she said, you established it the moment you placed that paper on the desk. The words fell into the room with quiet precision. Peveril stared. That is not possible, he said. He said he found it. Yes, Miss Marple said. He did say that. She took a small step toward the desk. And yet, we know that the paper did not originate here. Miss Harwood confirmed as much. It was moving. She turned her gaze back to Vale. And you were the only person who both had the opportunity and the reason to move it. Vale's expression did not change at once. Then slowly it altered. Not dramatically, but the arrangement of it shifted. You're making an assumption, he said. No, Miss Marple replied. I am making an observation. She folded her hands lightly. You wanted the paper to be seen, not by chance, but at a particular moment, after dinner, after certain conversations had taken place, after certain ideas had been introduced. Peveril drew in a breath. The manuscript, he said. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said. The manuscript. A study of identity, of constructed selves, of the danger of being seen clearly. She looked again at Vale. It was very cleverly done, she said, to introduce the theme before the evidence. It gives the appearance that the evidence confirms the theme, rather than the other way around. Vale smiled then, but it was not the same smile. You flatter me, he said. Miss Marple's expression remained mild. I do not flatter, she said. I observe. Eleanor felt the pieces align. You knew something, she said to Vale. Something about Miss Harwood. Vale did not deny it. Yes, he said. And you intended to reveal it, Eleanor continued. In time, Vale said. Using the paper, Eleanor said. Yes. Miss Harwood spoke then. Not reveal, she said. Her voice was very quiet. Expose. Vale turned to her. My dear Miss Harwood, he said, you must admit that truth, when it has been concealed for so long, often feels like exposure. Miss Marple shook her head slightly. No, she said. It feels like danger. The word settled. Eleanor looked at Miss Harwood. You were afraid, she said. Miss Harwood did not answer immediately. Then, yes, she said. Of what? Peveril asked. Miss Harwood's gaze moved. Not to him, but to Vale. Of being seen, she said. There was silence. Miss Marple spoke again. In St. Mary Mead, she said, there was a woman named Mrs. Ellerton, who had spent many years presenting herself as someone quite different from who she had been. She had done it very well, so well that no one questioned it, not even those who might have known better. She paused. Until one person did, she said. And what happened? Eleanor asked. Miss Marple's eyes softened. She became very frightened, she said, and frightened people do not always make kind decisions. Miss Harwood closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, the softness had returned, but it was no longer a veil. It was something else, something chosen. He knew, she said. Yes, Miss Marple replied. And he was going to tell, Miss Harwood said. Yes. Eleanor felt her breath catch. Then, she began. Miss Marple looked at her. My dear, she said, we must be very careful not to run ahead of ourselves. There are still one or two things that must be understood properly. She turned once more to the desk. The paper, she said. The earlier entry. Paid. The later entry. Not paid. Struck through twice. She looked at Miss Harwood. You did not change that entry, she said. Miss Harwood shook her head. No, she said. Miss Marple turned to Vale. You did, she said. There was no accusation in her tone, only certainty. Vale did not speak at once. Then, yes, he said. Peveril stared at him. Why? He asked. Vale's expression settled into something almost reflective. Because it was not paid, he said. Miss Marple regarded him. No, she said. Because you wished to suggest that it was not. Vale's gaze sharpened. And what difference does that make? He said. Miss Marple smiled very slightly. My dear Mr. Vale, she said. It makes all the difference. She looked at Miss Harwood. Because the true account, she said softly, had already been settled. The words seemed to change the air. Miss Harwood's hand trembled. Yes, she said. It had, Miss Marple said. There was a pause. Then Eleanor said very quietly, Then why is someone dead? Miss Marple's gaze moved at last to Jenkins. Because, she said, someone decided that the account must be opened again. And in that moment everyone in the room understood that the truth was no longer something that could remain unspoken. It was already present, waiting only to be recognized. Chapter 12. The account that was opened again. It was Miss Harwood who spoke first. Not quickly, not impulsively, but with a steadiness that suggested she had been moving toward this moment for a very long time. You're mistaken, she said. Her voice was quiet, yet it carried through the room without effort. The account was not settled. Miss Marple regarded her gently. "My dear," she said, "it was settled in the only way that truly matters. What you owed, you repaid. What was done to you, you endured. The rest remained," Miss Harwood said. There was no rise in her tone, no outward emotion, only a correction. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said, "for you." Miss Harwood's gaze did not waver. "For him as well," she said. Eleanor felt the weight of the words shift. "Mr. Vale," she said slowly. Miss Harwood nodded. "He knew?" she said. "Not at first, not when he came here, but he knew before tonight." Mr. Vale did not deny it. "I suspected," he said. "There is a difference." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes," she said, "there is. Though in your case, my dear Mr. Vale, the difference did not last very long." Vale's expression hardened. "I confirmed it," he said. "Quite easily, as it happens. People who construct their lives so carefully often leave small traces behind. A name used once too often, a date that does not align, a recollection that cannot quite be supported." Miss Harwood's hand tightened around the folded paper. "And you intended to use it," she said. Vale spread his hand slightly. "My dear Miss Harwood, I am a publisher. I deal in truths, or rather, in the presentation of truths. Your story, your life, if one prefers, would have been of considerable interest." "To whom?" she asked. "To anyone who values a well-constructed narrative," Vale replied. "A woman who has reinvented herself so completely that even those closest to her do not see the original shape beneath. It is compelling." Miss Marple's gaze rested on him. "And profitable," she said. Vale smiled. "That too." Eleanor felt a sudden, sharp clarity. "You were going to expose her," she said. "Expose is such an ungracious word," Vale replied. "I prefer reveal." "And if she had refused?" Eleanor asked. Vale's smile thinned. "Refusal would have complicated matters," he said, "but not prevent them." Miss Harwood's voice remained steady. "He came to me this afternoon," she said. "He told me what he knew. He told me what he intended to do." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "And you understood at once what that meant?" she said. "Yes," Miss Harwood said. Eleanor felt her breath catch. "And you?" she began. Miss Harwood looked at her. "I went to the room," she said. "The room that was not in use," Eleanor said. "Yes," Miss Harwood replied. "It was the only place where things had not changed." Miss Marple's expression softened. "You kept it as it was," she said. "Yes, and you went there to think," Miss Marple said. Miss Harwood shook her head. "No," she said. "I went there because I already knew what I would do." The words settled into the room with quiet finality. Peveril stepped back. "You cannot be suggesting," he began. Miss Harwood did not look at him. "I had kept everything in order," she said. "For years. The accounts, the house, myself, everything that might betray what I had been, or what had been done to me. I had kept it contained." Her voice did not tremble. "It was enough," she said, "until it was not." Miss Marple watched her. "Yes," she said softly. "That is very often the way." Eleanor felt the truth move closer. "And so you decided," she said. Miss Harwood finished the thought for her. "To prevent him," she said. Mr. Vale gave a short, sharp laugh. "My dear Miss Harwood, you give yourself too much credit. You did not prevent anything. I am still here." Miss Harwood looked at him. For a moment there was something in her gaze that Eleanor could not name. Then it settled. "Yes," she said, "you are." Miss Marple's eyes moved between them. "My dear," she said, "it is always best to be quite clear at this point. Words can mislead if they are not chosen carefully." Miss Harwood inclined her head. "Yes," she said, "they can." She took a breath. Then, "I gave him the coffee," she said. The room stilled. Eleanor felt the moment land. "The coffee," she said. "Yes," Miss Harwood replied. "In this room, after dinner." Miss Marple nodded. "A simple thing," she said, "and very easily overlooked." Mr. Vale's expression sharpened. "You are accusing yourself of something quite serious," he said. "You would do well to consider." Miss Harwood did not look at him. "I am not accusing myself," she said. "I am explaining." Eleanor's gaze moved to Jenkins. "Then he," she began. Miss Harwood's voice did not change. "He was not meant to," she said. The words were quiet, but they altered everything. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "Yes," she said. "That is what I thought." Peveril stared. "You mean he drank it?" he said. Miss Harwood nodded. "Yes." Eleanor felt a sudden cold clarity. "The coffee," she said. "You prepared it. You intended it for Mr. Vale." "Yes," Miss Harwood said. "And Jenkins," Eleanor continued. "He came in," Miss Harwood said, "to clear the cups. He saw the paper. He hesitated. Her voice faltered just for a moment. "He drank what remained," she said. Silence followed. Not shocked, not disbelieving. Simply absolute. Mr. Vale's voice cut through it. "This is absurd," he said. "Even if one accepts this extraordinary account, there is no evidence. No proof. A man has died, yes, but there is nothing to connect it to. The sequence," Miss Marple said. Vale stopped. Miss Marple opened her eyes. "The sequence," she repeated. "The preparation of the coffee, the movement of the paper, the return of Jenkins to the room, the sound we heard." She looked at Miss Harwood. "And the intention," she said. Miss Harwood met her gaze. "Yes," she said. Miss Marple nodded. "My dear," she said, "you intended to prevent something that you believed would destroy you." "Yes. And in doing so," Miss Marple continued, "you caused something else." Miss Harwood's hand tightened around the folded paper. "Yes," she said. Eleanor felt the weight of it. Not a sudden act, not an impulse, a decision, long prepared, carefully arranged, and fatally altered. Miss Marple turned to Mr. Vale. "And you," she said, "decided to reopen an account that had already been settled." Vale's expression hardened. "I decided to tell the truth," he said. Miss Marple regarded him. "No," she said, "you decided to use it." There was a pause. Then she added very quietly, "And now, my dear Mr. Vale, we must consider what remains to be paid." The words settled, heavy, final. And in that moment everyone understood that the truth had been spoken, but the consequences had only just begun. Chapter 13. What Remained and What Was Let Go. The doctor arrived an hour later. By then the house had settled into a strained and unnatural quiet, the sort that follows not shock but recognition. Lamps had been lit in every room along the main passage, their light steady but insufficient to soften the edges of what had occurred. Mrs. Trevelyan had withdrawn upstairs once the message was sent, her composure held together by something that resembled habit rather than strength. Peveril remained in the drawing-room, moving restlessly from chair to window and back again, as though attempting to outpace his own thoughts. Mr. Vale had not left the back parlour. He stood by the desk still, though he had shifted position once or twice, never straying far from the place where the paper lay. It had not been touched. That, Eleanor noticed, seemed to matter, as though altering it now would be to disturb something already decided. Miss Harwood sat quietly near the fire. She had not attempted to leave, nor had she spoken since her admission. The folded paper from the preserved room rested in her lap, her hands placed upon it with a calm that no longer required effort. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had resumed her seat as though the evening had returned to its original shape. Only the absence of Jenkins and the knowledge that absence carried prevented the illusion from being complete. Eleanor sat opposite her. It was Miss Marple who spoke first. "My dear Mrs. Sure," she said. "One always hopes in such situations that the truth will feel decisive when it comes, that it will settle matters, bring them to a close." Eleanor looked at her. "And does it?" she asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No," she said. "It rarely does. It simply replaces one uncertainty with another that is perhaps more honest." Eleanor considered this. "Then what is the point of understanding it?" she asked. Miss Marple's gaze moved briefly to Miss Harwood, then back again. "The point," she said gently, "is that people must be seen as they are, at least once, even if it is too late to alter what they have done." The doctor entered shortly after. He was a practical man, accustomed, it seemed, to the inconveniences of distance and the peculiarities of rural houses. He examined Jenkins with quiet efficiency, asked the necessary questions, and reached the conclusion that everyone in the room had already accepted. "A sudden failure of the heart," he said, "though I cannot be certain without further examination." He looked at Miss Harwood. "You prepared the coffee?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "And he drank it?" "Yes." The doctor nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It would be best," he said, "if the matter were reported properly. There are procedures." "Yes," Mrs. Trevelyan said from the doorway, her voice composed once more. "Of course." Mr. Vale spoke then. "I assume," he said, "that this will involve unnecessary complication. An inquest, perhaps. Questions. Speculation." The doctor regarded him. "Yes," he said, "that is generally how such matters proceed." Vale's mouth tightened. "Very well," he said, "we must endure it." Miss Marple watched him. "My dear Mr. Vale," she said, "endurance is not always the most difficult part." Vale did not reply. The formalities began. Messages were sent. Arrangements made. The house, which had held its breath, began at last to move again, not naturally, not easily, but with a purpose that replaced stillness with motion. Miss Harwood rose only once. She crossed the room and placed the folded paper from the preserved room beside the other on the desk. For a moment the two lay side by side. One marked, "Not paid," struck through twice. The other, "Not paid, unaltered." Miss Marple stood and moved to the desk. She looked at the two papers, then at Miss Harwood. "My dear," she said softly, "you have kept everything in order for a very long time." Miss Harwood inclined her head. "Yes," she said. "And now?" Miss Marple asked. Miss Harwood's gaze rested on the papers. "Now," she said. "It is no longer possible." Miss Marple nodded. "No," she said, "it is not." There was no judgment in her tone, only acknowledgement. Mr. Vale turned away. For the first time that evening he did not attempt to shape the moment. He simply withdrew from it. Peveril, meanwhile, had ceased his restless movement. He stood by the window, looking out into the darkened yard where the lantern still burned. "It is not the story I expected," he said quietly. Miss Marple glanced at him. "My dear Mr. Peveril," she said, "it rarely is." Eleanor felt a strange stillness settle within her, not the earlier tension, something quieter, more reflective. She looked at Miss Harwood. You said earlier, she said, that everything matters. That is the difficulty. Miss Harwood met her gaze. Yes, she said. Do you still believe that? Eleanor asked. Miss Harwood considered. Then, no, she said. The answer was simple, unadorned, and, Eleanor thought, entirely true. Later, when the house had quieted once more and the necessary arrangements had been set in motion, Miss Marple stood alone for a moment in the front parlour. Eleanor found her there. The green-shaded lamp still burned, casting its small, concentrated pool of light upon the ledger. It lay open again. Eleanor stepped closer. Has it changed? She asked. Miss Marple shook her head. No, she said. Not changed, only seen properly. Eleanor looked down. The page bore its entries, its careful lines, its precise notations. Nothing remarkable, nothing unusual, and yet everything is different. Miss Marple folded the ledger closed. I once knew a woman in St. Mary Mead, she said, who believed that if she kept her accounts perfectly, nothing truly bad could happen to her. She thought that order would protect her from consequences. She placed her hand lightly on the cover. It did not, of course, she said, but it gave her the illusion of safety, which is sometimes even more dangerous. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. And Miss Harwood? She asked. Miss Marple's expression softened. My dear, she said, she built a life that allowed her to live with what had been done to her. That is no small thing. But when that life was threatened, she did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Eleanor nodded. Yes, she said. Miss Marple turned toward the window. Outside, the rain had stopped. The yard lay still, the lantern casting its quiet circle of light upon the wet stones. For most of us, Miss Marple said gently, the past is something that fades, if we are fortunate. For some, it remains as present as the room one is standing in, and when that is the case. She paused, then finished very quietly. One must be very careful what one chooses to uncover. Eleanor followed her gaze. The house stood as it had before, unchanged, and yet not the same.